How can we know that Jesus performed miracles, was a religious leader, died and rose from the dead, or even existed in the first place? Couldn't he have been a made-up figure that the disciples used to gain power and influence? Over the past few centuries, there has been a growing interest in the historical Jesus. This is a study of what historical documents say about Jesus. We should note that if there is any documentation about a first-century Jewish carpenter who lived a normal life for 30 years before starting a 3-year ministry that ended with his death, it would be extraordinary. Most of what we know about ancient history is based on a handful of archaeological sources or writings from historians who lived hundreds of years after the event or figure they were writing about. Some critics of Christianity complain that there is not enough historical evidence to prove that Jesus existed, but if they used the same standards on other historical events and figures, we would know virtually nothing about ancient history. There are a vast number of sources that reveal significant details about Jesus' life, death, and legacy. Let's start by differentiating between biblical and extra-biblical sources. Biblical sources would be the 27 separate writings that are collected within the Bible. These sources include the 4 Gospels, the Book of Acts, and the 22 letters that were written by Paul, Peter, John, James, and Jude. There is some debate over when these sources were written, but the letters are usually dated within a few decades of Jesus' death, and the Gospels are usually dated between 55 and 120 AD. Regardless, the Gospels are the earliest biographies of Jesus' life. The study of the historical Jesus relies on extra-biblical sources, which are sources that are outside of the Bible. These sources include archaeology, creeds, non-Christian sources, and Christian sources. Archaeology is the weakest area in the study of the historical Jesus. While archaeological discoveries have been made supporting the details of the New Testament writers, there is little here that helps us understand the historical Jesus better. This moves us to creeds. Early Christian creeds were first recited orally and then written down. Since these creeds appear in the Bible, some say that they are not extra-biblical sources. However, since they originated prior to the Bible and were simply recorded by biblical authors, they can be considered extra-biblical to an extent. These creeds are sometimes dated to within 5 years of Jesus' death and reveal what early Christians were proclaiming about Jesus. We will look at just 2 creeds in this video. The first is the Apostles' Creed, which can be found in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, which highlights how Jesus' death and resurrection were being proclaimed by early Christians. The many witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were named, which allowed people to hear the testimony of the eyewitnesses, since most were still alive at the time of this creed's origin. The second creed is found in Philippians 2, 6-11. Again, this creed focuses on Jesus' death and resurrection, but also touches on Jesus' divine and human natures. Non-Christian sources can also be used to paint a picture of the historical Jesus. Historians such as Tacitus, Josephus, Suetonius, and Thallus, along with government officials like Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and Pliny the Younger, write about Jesus. We can also turn to both Jewish sources such as the Talmud and Gentile sources such as Lucian for more insight about Jesus from a historical perspective. Gnostic writings such as the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Thomas should be considered non-Christian as well, despite the claim by the authors to be Christians. Finally, there are lost works that were cited by others which refer to Jesus, such as the Acts of Pontius Pilate. Using only these non-Christian sources, we can gather much about Jesus. He was a man who lived around Palestine and was known as a wise man. He performed miracles and made prophecies that were later fulfilled. He had many disciples that were both Jews and Gentiles. He was worshipped as God, and many believed that he was the Messiah. His teachings emphasized faith, obedience, unity among believers, and conversion. The Jewish religious leaders did not like Jesus' teaching, so they plotted to kill him. They eventually did put him to death through crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. He was crucified the night before the Passover and was nailed to the cross where guards gambled for his clothes. That night, a great earthquake struck and darkness covered the land for 3 hours. After Jesus' death, his disciples began proclaiming that he rose from the dead, and Christianity began spreading. His followers were named Christians after Jesus Christ and would gather in the morning once a week to sing songs and worship Jesus together. Christianity quickly spread despite Christians being persecuted for their beliefs. Considering this can all be gathered from non-Christian historical sources is incredible. These sources shed light on who Jesus was from an unbiased perspective. Next, we will look at extra-biblical Christian sources that mention Jesus between the years 90 and 155 AD. Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Justin Martyr are among these Christian sources. Using only these Christian sources, we can affirm much of what we read in the biblical accounts of Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem by Mary, who was a virgin. Jesus healed people and rose others from the dead. Jesus predicted his death while he was still living, and his central teaching was the gospel. His disciples would go into surrounding towns preaching this gospel to the people. Jesus was later crucified, died, and was buried. His followers abandoned him, but 3 days later they proclaimed that he rose from the dead. He stayed with his disciples for a short time before ascending back to heaven. We have 45 ancient extra-biblical sources that teach us about Jesus' life, ministry, death, resurrection, and legacy on top of 27 biblical sources. People will still try to deny all this evidence, but the fact is that the biblical portrayal of Jesus Christ is in line with the historical Jesus.